they would never let me be president. She's referring to some mysterious they. Surely it's exactly the opposite. They did everything they can to make her president.
But see, now in the blame game, still, the people don't enter into it, do they? For her, it still is this mashup of conspiracies, of particularly powerful groups or people. But it's never occurred to her that we actually went out and voted, that despite all of the legacy media, despite all of the money, $1 billion she spent, that we still thought, wait a minute, we're going to do X. We're not necessarily going to conform. We actually are an independent body that will make a decision. That's why your program matters. It's why Fox News matters, because it's about not conforming. It is really about challenging power and recognizing the power, frankly, the beauty of the American individual, which is what's fueled certainly not just, of course, the establishment of the country, but how we've been able to deal with the challenges we've had for the last 300 years.
Exactly, and that is the big idea underneath this whole populist revolution, and the fact that they can't see it and actually argue against it and claim that they're the ones that really represent the Constitution and so on. It's just so hypocritical.
But see, that requires ideas, though. What you're hearing and with your clips that you had there, it's all about these vague emotional pushes. It's never about policy or about the larger idea. Well, of course they don't want to talk about policy, because actually if you talk about, what have you got? Progress with North Korea, jobs coming back, wages going up, all of that, that's the last thing they want to talk about. Anyway, we've got to move on. You watched it live last week as we put James Comey on trial. But will there ever be a real-life reckoning for the former FBI director? One of 11 Republican congressmen asking for an impeachment. So you're saying, okay, well, let's leave it like that. Maybe hang on a second. It's not just Comey, it's a whole bunch of them.
Well, of course it is, absolutely, in various steps. But the facts are that James Comey is one of the people, one of the individuals you just stated yourself that in fact had to put this forward and proffer it to say, let's get the information.
All right, sorry. Last week we put James Comey on trial. You all thought he was guilty. So the question is, what happens next? This week I wrote an opinion piece on foxnews.com, and this is part of what I said. There's at least as much reason to suspect that the FBI, Department of Justice, and others in the federal bureaucracy colluded with the Obama administration and Clinton campaign to influence the 2016 election, as there are reasons to suspect that Donald Trump and his associates colluded with the Russians in similar vein. And yet, in this 50-50 swamp of suspicion and confusion, 100% of the investigative energy is going in one direction only. This is making America's divisions deeper by the day. If we want to truly understand what happened in the 2016 presidential election, and if we want to move beyond this polarized political moment, then we have to see equal justice done. James Comey, John Brennan, James Clapper, Hillary Clinton, President Obama, and former Attorney General Loretta Lynch, all of them must be investigated, and if justified by evidence turned up in those investigations, prosecuted. That's what I wrote. But meanwhile, 11 members of Congress last week sent a criminal referral to the Justice Department and the FBI seeking an investigation of James Comey, Andrew McCabe, ex-Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and Hillary Clinton in connection with 2016 campaign controversies. We've got one of those members of Congress joining us live tonight, Florida Republican Congressman Ted Yoho. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Hey, I read your article and you were spot on, and I'm glad for you to bring that out and go that direction.
And likewise, I think that your move last week with your colleagues was spot on. But what I really want to do is not so much go back over the who did what and focus on the question, which is what's going to happen next. I think people watching tonight are so frustrated that, as I said, all the energy is on one side of this. What's actually going to happen? There's so much suspicion now of the behavior of the FBI and so on. You've put your referral in. What happens to that?
Well, you're right. The American people are fed up. They want justice. You know, when people go above the law or they think they're above the law, they're frustrated. And there's you can tell why the American people are so frustrated, because nothing gets done up there in this investigation. What I propose, or what I would conjecture here, is it's going to move forward. And I think you're going to see this web go back to Comey, McCabe, the other people, Miss Clinton, Loretta Lynch, and possibly President Obama.
Okay, but is anything going to happen? I mean, we can all agree with each other about how terrible it is, but what's going to happen? You've got this incredible investigation going on into President Trump and his world. What about the other side? What's going to actually happen?
Well, I think what you're going to see, as this letter stated out, it was very succinct and very detailed on the charges for Ms. Clinton, for Mr. Comey, Andrew McCabe, and I think you're going to see this go into an investigation. We're going to keep the pressure up. The American people are going to keep the pressure up on us, you know, the representatives of the People's House.
Well, sorry
and so
to cut.
I think you're going to see this move forward. What's that?
What gives you that confidence? What gives you the confidence that it will, in your words, move into an investigation? Who's going to start it?
Well, I think
Who's
the biggest thing is the biggest thing. It's the right thing to do. It's like you said. It's been one-sided. You know,
I
when
get all
James
that. I'm
Comey
sorry
did
to
what
press
he
you
did-
on. I'm sorry, Congressman.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to press you on it and to cut you off. So I don't want to waste time on agreeing with each other. The real question I'm interested in is who's going to make this investigation actually happen? Whose job is it?
It's referred to. Well, it's going to go from the House. Paul Ryan will move forward, or the Judiciary Committee, and then the Intelligence Committee, and then the AG ultimately will decide to do this, or Rod Rosenstein to move forward on this. And this is where it needs to go. I mean, it really does.
So the responsibility. So the only way this happens is if the Attorney General makes it happen. Is that what you're saying?
Right. I mean, it's got to move forward through him. And, I know the letters are out there. We're talking to him. There's people that are talking to him to move this forward. Like you said, the American people are fed up with this, and we need to go down this path.
But so what's the, if you like, the official role of your letter? Is it basically just a press release that adds to the conversation but doesn't move anything forward?
No, I know Ron DeSantis, he's like I am, and the people that sign that, we don't do things for press release. This is something that has to be done. When you got people that, if you go back to the investigation on Donald Trump with the Russian probe, that should never have happened, because that was based on false allegations on the Steele dossier that was all concocted through the Hillary Clinton campaign and Fusion 1. And then the first FISA warrant, maybe that could have been signed, but those other three should never have been signed. Therefore, that investigation should never have happened. It's time to bring that investigation to a close and then go after the perpetrators that concocted that stuff and lied to the committees. It's already documented that they did lie to the committees. So those are the ones that need to be followed, and let that rabbit trail go where it will. I mean, that's really what has to happen. And our goal is to make sure those things happen. We hear it in our districts every time we come back. When is somebody in Washington going to be held accountable? And we're going to make sure that does. And we just keep pressure on them.
Good. I think I understand that it's not it's not within your power or your colleagues to initiate the investigation, but I think you've set it out very clearly for us. I do appreciate that. And I think as far as
I'm glad I cleared
certainly
it.
From the reaction to our show last week is keep up the pressure, because people really want something done. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Have a great night.
So, joining Tammy now on the panel is nationally syndicated radio host and Fox News contributor Richard Fowler, who I don't just suspect, I saw him violently shaking his head almost at everything that was said.
He was laughing a couple times. He was laughing.
Take it away, Richard.
Well, I mean, I wasn't laughing. I mean, listen, if we want to have an investigation, let's do it. But there's a couple things that was...
Well, hang on, that's an important thing.
Well,
let's do it.
But there's some factual inaccuracies with what the congressman said. Number one, the Russia investigation was triggered by George Papadopoulos. That was in the Devin Nunes memo from the Republican committee. That's a fact, number one. Number two, the letter that was released by these 11 members of Congress, the chairman of the Government Oversight Committee, Trey Gowdy, said himself that letter should be referred back to the Inspector General of the Justice Department, and that's where it should be handled, not by Congress, not by Rod Rosenstein, not by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It should be handled by the person already handling the internal investigation, the Inspector General, period. So these things have already been hashed out.
Okay, let me ask you a different... I want to put it...
So
take a few steps back, right, and look at it from the perspective of someone who's not following it that closely. And further, I'd ask you to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is part of pro-Trump America, right? And they see all this going on, all this energy devoted to investigating the president. And then they think, hang on a second, I don't know for sure, but it looks to me like there was dodgy stuff going on with the FBI and Comey and Clinton. Nothing being investigated. Don't you think, just in terms of bringing the country together, just for the sake of fairness, you need to have an equivalent investigation on the other side? Do you agree with that?
So I think that's an interesting perspective. And I was sitting in the green room sort of reading over your op-ed one more time, and it struck me as this, and I think we have a larger problem in this country, and the problem that we have in this country is the criminality of law enforcement is not handled the same way as the criminality of everyday Americans. So if me and Tammy were to break the law, we are treated differently.
Which we would never do.
We would never do. We are treated differently than when police officers or law enforcement breaks the law. They're treated to a different standard.
We would even have a different standard because we're on television.
Very
so
true.
the average person,
average American breaks the law. They're treated differently.
So there's now, but I would say that facts do matter, and this is a major point. We see it certainly at the local level.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing it unfold here because you've got systems, but you've got systems that have been used to being able to do this for generations. So this is not new. It's not because of Obama. It's not because of Comey. This is something that got settled in, and the fact that it was disrupted, whether you like Donald Trump or not, is what has shocked them. But also, I would contend, everyone has been very sloppy in what it is they've been doing on that side because they genuinely thought it wouldn't matter. And so this is whether it's Hillary and, wiping off her server, or Comey and what he was doing, or Strzok and Page and their text messages. It was like a frat house that was like a toga party, and they thought nothing, because it was going to be a Hillary Clinton presidency, which also tells you that they thought that with that presidency, nothing that they did would matter. And that should frighten us as well.
And let me just go a step further. And when I talk about the criminality of law enforcement, this is the connection that I think people don't make, what might possibly connect the Black Lives Matter movement and the Trump Make America Great Again movement, is that this is the same argument that they're making, is when BLM says we don't have a problem with law enforcement, we have a problem with police brutality and the fact that the criminality of law enforcement isn't treated the same. And what the Trump people are saying is, there's some shadiness with the FBI and nobody's treating it the same.
What could solve it?
And this is the same thing because Eric Garner was choked to death by the police on camera, and all those officers walked. And at the same time, in the FBI, there was some shady text messages, and these people are being prosecuted. It's the same level of criminality.
At the same point, in every dynamic, there's also, you've got a sliver of something that's shown on camera, then you've got the larger context of what is going on there. And we can say the same thing when it comes to the government. Wouldn't an interesting solution, though, is to put cameras on everybody at the FBI in the suites? Have a camera on Comey, have a camera on McCabe. But here's where the real danger is. When we think about what's happening and inspector generals and who makes these decisions, already we have a criminal referral to the Attorney General by the Inspector General regarding Mr. McCabe. That is where you start getting into, that was maybe the fruit that was low-lying at this point, sending a message to everyone that something you normally would have gotten away with, not only have you been caught, but you're not going to go and get your pension like Lois Lerner did. We are going to criminally refer you. Now, the next step is, will the Attorney General, with it being a very unusual situation, really bring charges against Mr. McCabe and use that for those who are in the swamp, the bureaucrats, who we don't know their names, who facilitate this, who then will at least feel free or at least get immunity to speak up about what's been going on at the FBI, because this affects the regular people who are affected by this law enforcement agency being used now as a partisan cudgel. You can't then trust anything else that they do, whether it's missing the terrorists that they knew about, or whether it's about acting as partisan hacks.
I think that's the nub of it, and I think that there's a lot of pressure on the Attorney General to do something, but sadly it doesn't look like anything's happening. Anyway, I'm sorry we've got to leave it there. Coming up, despite President Trump's agenda, his administration is crawling with lobbyists. The details in tonight's Swamp Watch. But next, our exclusive interview with the man behind Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the Supreme Court, and on how President Trump's judicial appointments are helping to cut back the deep state. I wanted to find out what was that all about, so I had the pleasure of speaking with Leonard Leo. He's the advisor to the president on judicial nominations and the man that many credit with convincing the president to put Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. I talked to him about how President Trump's judicial appointments are helping to fight the bureaucracy of the administrative state. Take a look. Joining me from Washington, Executive Vice President of the Federalist Society, Leonard Leo. Leonard, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really am thrilled to have you here. I just want to make sure that our viewers understand what a significant person you are. You've been described by some as the most powerful recruiter in the world, the conservative pipeline to the Supreme Court, less kindly perhaps, but just as much emphasizing your influence, the judicial puppet master. What they're talking about is the fact that you're the person that is in the lead in terms of advising President Trump and the administration on judicial appointments, not just most notably Neil Gorsuch, but actually right the way through the judicial system, leaving an incredibly important legacy, probably the most important lasting legacy from this president. And I just wanted our audience to understand that you're in the driving seat there. And I'd love to start with the big picture. What is the legal philosophy you're bringing to that advice that you're giving the president and the administration on judicial appointments?
Well, basically, the idea is that judges ought to be interpreting the Constitution the way the framers meant it to be, according to its words, very specifically, and that the courts have a role to play in enforcing all those structural features of the Constitution that limit the power of our government, because ultimately it's that protection of freedom that the courts can do by enforcing the structural limits on government power.
And do you think that the way that appointments have been made in the past have gone in a direction away from that?
Not in this administration, but in prior administrations, particularly during the Obama administration, there were a lot of judicial appointees who didn't believe that the courts had a role to play in enforcing the structural limits on government power, which are so important to the preservation of freedom and dignity.
So I just wanted to get now into the detail of it. I think the discussion around Neil Gorsuch has been widely had. A lot of people familiar with his views and what he brings to the Supreme Court. I want to focus on a subject that we talk about a lot here on this show, whatever you want to call it, the administrative state, the deep state, the way in which there's this sense of a permanent bureaucracy that advances an agenda. And I want to start by going into something that many people will think is very nerdy and wonky, but actually really at the heart of this. There's a ruling, isn't there, that's vital to this notion of the role of the judiciary in relation to the administration of government, and that's the Chevron case. And that was one of the things that I think that really recommended Justice Gorsuch. Could you just explain to us the significance of the Chevron case and what it means for the administrative state?
Sure. Well, first of all, Steve, I'm really glad you brought this up, because at the end of the day, this was the first Supreme Court confirmation where this whole issue was front and center. And basically, the debate was about the extent to which judges ought to be deferring to decisions that are made by administrative agencies. And what was the subject of such debate during the Gorsuch confirmation was Neil Gorsuch's view that judges have a very important role to play in ensuring that administrative agencies are accountable, transparent, and fair. And that means judges shouldn't just roll over and play dead every time an administrative agency or a regulator makes a decision. Judges have a duty, a constitutional duty, to look carefully at what the administrative agency is doing and to make sure it's staying within the bounds of its power as defined either by the Constitution or by a statute within the U.S. Code.
That's so important, isn't it? Because what you've seen happen is this shift of power to the administrative state in its various forms. And it sounds like what you're trying to do here is correct that and shift the power back to where it should be. The last question I wanted to ask you was about how this is being applied beyond the Supreme Court. There was a story in the New York Times the other week, which the headline is that Trump's new judicial litmus test, shrinking the administrative state. And it argues that actually one of the most significant things that's going on with this administration, driven by the philosophy that you've outlined, is the appointment of judges throughout the system who've got this attitude about shrinking or at least putting the administrative state back within the confines that it should be in. Would you accept that characterization that shrinking the administrative state is a litmus test for the judges that you're recommending?
I wouldn't really say that it's about shrinking the administrative state. The president's certainly doing that in his deregulatory agenda. But what this is really about is making sure that administrative agencies live by the law. In other words, that when they are making decisions, that they are respecting the statutes that created their agency and the Constitution of the United States. And it's a judge's job to basically look at what those agencies are doing and make sure they're following the law. That's accountability, it's transparency, it's living up to the separation of powers in our Constitution, and judges have a duty to make sure that administrative agencies are following the law, just as they have a duty to make sure that Congress or the president or anyone else that wields government authority is following the law.
Leonard, it's amazing that is actually seen by some as a radical shift. It just shows how far power's gone in the wrong direction. But I think that what you're doing there to try and bring it back to what the Constitution intended is just heroic work. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm so glad that we had a chance to talk about it tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, let's see if I can get through the rest of the show without saying the word administrative, correctly or incorrectly. I think we've had enough of that word. Coming up in Swamp Watch tonight, we reveal the lobbyists working inside the Trump administration despite the president's drain the swamp agenda. Don't go away. Today, after a new report detailing questionable ties to lobbyists and serious concerns about his judgment dating back to Pruitt's time as a state senator in Oklahoma. White House Legislative Affairs Director Mark Short quickly responded.
Scott Pruitt's doing a phenomenal job, and the president's happy with him. And
full confidence.
Yes.
What would it take for him to lose confidence?
Chuck, that's a hypothetical. I don't know. Right now, Scott Pruitt's doing a great job at EPA, and we're excited to have him there.
Remember, President Trump's historic election win was driven in part by a drain-the-swamp agenda, an agenda we strongly support here on The Next Revolution. And in many ways, the president has delivered, banning officials from lobbying for foreign governments after they leave the administration and preventing them from lobbying agencies where they once worked. President Trump has also cut regulations, which means less bureaucracy, and that means less opportunity for lobbying and corruption. But this whole agenda is undermined when members of his own administration don't live up to the drain the swamp standards. President Trump appointees' abuse of power is this week's Swamp Watch. We talk a lot on this show about government officials cashing in on their time in public service by becoming lobbyists after they leave. But the revolving door works both ways, and despite President Trump's drain the swamp agenda, it's still happening. One government watchdog recently released a study finding a shocking number of former lobbyists now working in this administration and regulating the same interests they used to lobby for. There are 133 appointees in the executive branch alone who previously served as registered lobbyists, including 60 who did so within just 2 years of joining the federal government. Of those 60, 36 had specifically lobbied the agencies where they now work, and only 6 had obtained the ethics waiver necessary to make it legal, leaving 30 members of the executive branch allegedly in violation of the president's executive orders designed to prevent such conflicts of interest. One of them is Keegan Lenihan, a senior official at the Department of Health and Human Services. He formerly worked as a lobbyist representing drug giant McKesson Corporation and its affiliate US Oncology. In his current post, he advises the secretary who oversees the agency in charge of creating national drug policies. Isn't that convenient for his former paymasters? A separate study found 184 former lobbyists working in this administration, including Leonard Wolfson, an official at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Turns out that Wolfson formerly lobbied for the Mortgage Bankers Association, and it's not even his first time through the revolving door. He also worked in George W. Bush's housing department. From dealing with housing finance in government to lobbying for housing finance and back to the government. That's the swamp right there. Here's another one, Rebecca Adcock. She's an official in the Department of Agriculture. She used to lobby that same department as Senior Director of Government Affairs at CropLife America. Before that, she was Director of Congressional Relations for the American Farm Bureau Federation, where her portfolio included USDA conservation programs, i.e. subsidies. These conflicts of interest are just one way that members of the Trump administration are undermining their boss's drain the swamp agenda. A number of higher-level officials have abused their power in far more public ways. Let's start with former VA Secretary David Shulkin, who resigned amid widespread controversy over a taxpayer-funded trip to Europe, with his wife, staff and security detail visiting castles and attending a tennis match at Wimbledon. I hope he enjoyed the strawberries and cream that you paid for. Former Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price spent over $1 million of taxpayer money flying on private and military jets. At least President Trump fired him. Then there's Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, who's also spared no expense at your expense when it comes to travel. He's reportedly spent nearly $1 million of department money to fly on military aircraft. In fact, Mnuchin has reportedly not flown on a single commercial flight for business-related travel since taking office. Looks like Mnuchin, a former Wall Street executive with an estimated net worth of $300 million, got used to the lifestyle of the wealthy elite, and now he wants hard-working American taxpayers to continue to fund it. Unbelievably, his wife posted a photo of her and her husband disembarking a taxpayer-funded military plane while hashtagging her designer clothing brands. She also seemed to relish being part of this photo of cold hard cash with her husband's name on it. Here's a hint. His name's on it because he's the Treasury Secretary. It's not your money, it's ours. But none of President Trump's appointees have been under more scrutiny for swampy behavior than EPA Chief Scott Pruitt. He also likes to travel in style, having spent more than $100,000 on first-class airfare tickets, citing safety concerns as justification, as well as nearly $60,000 on charter and military jet flights. When Pruitt requested enormous pay raises for his staff, including a $29,000 raise for his scheduling director, the White House rejected the requests, but Pruitt didn't let that stop him. He reportedly used an obscure provision in the Safe Drinking Water Act to force the raises through. He's also spent your money upgrading his office, conducting expensive security sweeps for hidden listening devices, and purchasing sophisticated biometric locks for additional security. Not to mention the $43,000 spent to convert a storage closet into a soundproof booth where Pruitt could make secure phone calls. He's the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, not the CIA. Worst of all, he seems to be in bed with swampy lobbyists, almost literally. For a cut-price rate, Pruitt rented a condo co-owned by the wife of an energy lobbyist whose firm conducted business before the EPA that same year. Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney recently promised to investigate whether Pruitt violated federal statutes with his exorbitant spending. But the last thing we need in Washington is another investigation. What we need is for President Trump to take the lead, fire Scott Pruitt, and throw out the lobbyists from his administration. President Trump's Drain the Swamp agenda is vital. It helped him get elected, and it's a huge part of the change that needs to happen in Washington, D.C. Too many people there still seem to think it's business as usual. President Trump, show them they're wrong and go drain that swamp. So, the panel's been listening. Tammy says she's got an interesting angle on this. We'll hear what it is after the break when she and Richard debate tonight's Swamp Watch. Don't go away.
No, he's serious about that. He is an outsider, but he also, and he wants to drain the swamp, but he also has to run the government. And you saw in the beginning an interesting mix of pulling in people who were part of the government. Reince Priebus is an example. And then you've got the Shulkin, which was a shocking appointment to me. You know, how are you going to reform the VA from a guy who's been in there and part of the problem? So I think it was a combination of him needing people who had experience, who as a result come from the political class, who can run things, while also at the same time hoping that there'll be traitors to their political class and work to dismantle the same thing. But let me just give you a perspective here. The budget for 2019 fiscal year is $4.4 trillion. We just went through the omnibus, which increased the budget by another $1 trillion. For a government this big, and this is the problem, money becomes like water for everyone, not just agency heads, but especially this swampy swamp underneath the heads of all the bureaucrats.
Yes.
The people who've been in there who are civil professionals who are in there for years and decades and who also are working to undermine the president.
Yes.
I think you could work and get a scalp for every single agency if you wanted to based on spending. But I don't recall these conversations either when Barack Obama was using an airplane to fly fly only his dog to the Hamptons.
Yes, well,
Now, we do need this to change, I agree. But we also need it to go at a point where the president has got to set a tone and tell Pruitt to stop some of the nonsense. But it also has to be, we have to make sure he's got people who do follow his agenda and implement it, while at the same time where we don't accept business as usual, or at least try to cut it down as it occurs. Because otherwise, all we're going to do, and the president obviously likes to fire people, but we need to get these things implemented. We've got to call it out when it happens.
Yes.
And with someone like Shulkin, who actually had his chief of staff alter an email.
You're looking very skeptical. Go for it, Richard.
Listen, this is Barack Obama did it running a platform, Drain the Swamp. This has nothing to do with President Obama. This has everything to do with President Donald Trump running on a platform saying he was going to drain the swamp, also running on a platform of saying that I hire the best people. So let's look at the people that he's hired, right? So you have Scott Pruitt, who has wasted taxpayer dollars. You could blame this on government bureaucrats if you want to, but Scott Pruitt has wasted taxpayer dollars, and he's not the only person, right? I mean, look at this cabinet. You have Ben Carson spent $30,000 on a dining table. You have Betsy DeVos, who before she got to the Department of Education was one of the #1 lobbyists in Michigan, destroying public education. We could have a debate versus charter school versus public school. But when you have somebody who literally lobbied only for charter schools and spent millions of dollars doing it, who now works and runs the Department of Education, that is problematic, right? And so once over and over again, what you see from this administration is he says one thing, but his administration, not him, but his administration does something different. So if this president wants to drain the swamp,
he's frustrated about that.
He should be.
Well, but
he
look,
absolutely should be.
His standard and why we knew that Shulkin was going to have problems and why this is an issue is because the president doesn't like waste. He doesn't like waste. But the issue is that are we going to be consistent in what we want? Conservatives constantly we want smaller government. We want more of our money in the pockets of the average citizen. But as long as Democrats and liberals think government is the solution, it will only get larger and money will become like water in the ocean.
We haven't got time for it. Look, we're going to keep coming. Sorry, we got to stop. We're going to come back to this.
This will be 2 parts. We'll do it next week.
We'll do it next week.
Yes.
Coming up. Music superstar Moby sparks debate with his comments on food stamps, of all things. My take on that next. That track you can hear is the classic club anthem Go by the legendary DJ Moby. When I was in my younger clubbing days, I loved his album, and now I love his arguments. He recently wrote a brilliant piece for the Wall Street Journal about how billions of dollars of taxpayer money in the food stamps program ends up subsidizing giant corporations that produce unhealthy food that literally makes people sick, leading to even higher costs for the taxpayer. Moby's asking Congress to fix it in the farm bill that's under consideration right now, and I agree. That's the next revolution we need. Thank you to our panel. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hope you can join us next Sunday when the next revolution